East, particularly for those of you who are coming here for the first time. My name's Andrew Rowan. I'm Managing Director of Plexel, so the facility that you're in now. And we're delighted to welcome you to what should be a wonderful evening of socialising, learning, reflecting on the wonderful history of the internet. Now, firstly, just a personal reflection. So I've got a lot to thank the internet for. So every single job I've had has been based on some form of infrastructure linked to the internet. So I started my career working for Marconi in the dot-com boom phase when they were building out telecoms infrastructure around the planet. I then moved to cable and wireless, so continued the ISP journey and looked at the scaling of that infrastructure around the world. Then into the data center sector and looked at how we could expand the impact the internet was having on society. And then I expected that I wouldn't have a job linked to the internet next, and this project came around. So what we're trying to achieve here is to build a technology cluster where we bring together academics, large enterprises, and innovators all in one place to start to cause collaboration and change through innovation. Now, lots of what we do here is bringing parties together. So events like this, bringing public sector, private sector together in order to stimulate funding and change programs, particularly motivated by the goals of Olympic legacy, as we inherited so much from what was built for 2012. Now, all of that innovation and change builds on the internet. It's the fundamental platform that's allowing all of this to emerge. So I certainly wouldn't be here without this wonderful history, and I'm looking forward to planning the next few decades worth of change in this area of East London using social regeneration, education opportunities, economic growth as the opportunity for us to build on the success of the last 50 years, and obviously manage some of the risks that no doubt we'll talk about tonight. Now, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here, and what I say at events like this often is we want this to be the start of a new collaboration. So I've already had a few conversations with new people this evening that I'd never met before that I know there's a good follow-on with. Please talk to each other, find an opportunity to collaborate. If you ever want to come back to this location, you're very welcome, and we'd love to explore what we could do together in order to build on this collaboration and change activity. Now, there's a few thank yous before we get started. So particularly to our co-sponsors, so particularly ESOP for the wonderful graphics, the monitor display that you saw in reception, which is so effective and impactful. Have a look at it on the way out if you didn't notice it. So here East, so the campus, the big scale facility that you're at now, in particular, Jessel, Helen, Megan and Sophie. Thanks to my team for all the effort that they've put into delivering tonight, particularly Jed. And our co-conspirators, so particularly Jim Bolton, who you're going to hear from next, and Jake, who've been running a series of programs over the last few days using this subject matter to get into, particularly into local schools and start to talk about the wonderful heritage of this product and allowing the next generation to come through and build on that. So please enjoy this evening. As I say, it's as much about networking as it is about the subject matter that you'll be so inspired by. And let's see you afterwards and hope you enjoy yourself. So thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm Jim. And the first thing I've got to tell you is the hashtag and the social media handles that you're supposed to be following. So I trust you'll all tweet and share everything here on social media. I thought it was a bit egotistical to put a picture of me on the screen, so I thought I'd put a picture of my shed. It's a beautiful shed. This is where I hang out. This is where the magic happens. This is where I restore old websites to their former glory. And it's a project called Digital Archaeology. And after exploring the early days of the web, I started to dig a bit deeper and started to explore the early years of the internet. I was 50 this year, same as the internet, and to celebrate, I decided that I was going to go and visit the place it all began, not Doncaster Royal Infirmary, but Bolter Hall at the University of California, Los Angeles, where a team led by Leonard Kleinrock sent the first message over the ARPANET on the 29th of October, 1969. And actually, it was sent at 10:30 p.m. at night, which is 5:30 a.m. UK time, so we're actually bang on doing the celebration today rather than yesterday. That's Leonard Kleinrock on the left and John Poston in the middle and a couple of the other graduate students there. That's the room it all happened in. And I got in touch, due to the power of the internet, I got in touch with Leonard and said, is it all right if I come and visit you? And if you can show me around. And being the lovely guy that he is, and it's actually something that's common of a lot of the people that were involved in the early internet and the early web. They're kind of very generous people with their time and their effort and their energy. And Leonard was no different. So I decided I was going to go and visit him. And I dragged along my friend Jake. That's not Jake, that's Leonard. Because Jake and I are doing a project on the history of the internet. We're creating a graphic history of the internet, a comic. We asked Leonard if we could go along. He said fine, and we spent a whole afternoon with Leonard talking about the early days. We filmed it all. We've made it into a 30-minute documentary, and I'm hoping some of you can stay behind afterwards to watch it. While I was there, Leonard said, I'm doing a celebration of 50 years of the internet, and there's other celebrations happening all around the world. But as far as I'm aware, there's none happening in London, so you should do one. And he's a very persuasive guy. And before I'd thought it through, I'd agreed. And here we are. And obviously, when you're putting on an event like this, you need some speakers. And we're very lucky that we've got 4 fantastic speakers. I feel so privileged and so lucky. One of the reasons Leonard said that we should put on an event in London is because London played a key part in the early days of the internet, and particularly this next gentleman, Peter Kirstine, Cbe no less. And Peter's still a professor of computer science at UCL, who of course got departments based here. And Peter was the first person to put a computer on the ARPANET outside of the US in 1973, as well as other claims to fame. He's a key part of creating the Internet Protocol Suite, along with Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, and implementing it in the mid-70s. So we're going to show a short interview that Peter and I did together last month, and then we're going to sit down with Peter and get some of his observations. We've got a friend of mine and an inspiration, Ava Pascoe, serial digital entrepreneur who set up the first internet cafe in London in '94, I think it was, set up a digital think tank, Cybersalon in '97, really early into e-commerce. She's going to be talking to us about the difference the web made when the web became part of the internet landscape and a broader set of people came on board. We're finishing with Plexel's very own Saj Huck. He's the program director of Lorca, which is the cybersecurity research team here at Plexel. He's going to be talking about the opportunities and challenges that total connectivity bring along, especially in the age of mistrust. So really looking forward to that. But we're starting off with Alan Cain, who's a personal computing pioneer and a bit of a legend. He's best known for creating the Dynabook, which was a carry-all device, a personal computer for kids of all ages. That's kind of familiar. And he came up with this concept, this idea, in the late 60s while he was at the University of Utah. And he was actually there when Utah became the 4th node on the ARPANET. After the University of Utah, I believe, he went to work at Xerox, where there was a huge amount of pioneering breakthroughs. The Dynabook came to life in the form of the Alto, but they created the Ethernet, they created laser printing, graphical user interface, object-oriented programming, modern computing as we know it. But what I think people don't necessarily realize is the overlap between the ARPA community and Xerox PARC. A lot of the graduate students that were sponsored by the ARPA project ended up finding jobs at Xerox PARC. And indeed, the leader of IPTO, the Information Processing Techniques Office at ARPA, Bob Taylor, ended up running Xerox PARC. So there's a big crossover, and it's almost like one community. So Alan's going to be talking about the culture at Xerox PARC and the ARPA community that led to such a fantastic number of breakthroughs in such a short period of time. The other thing people might not know as well is that Alan is Tron. And after a kind of visit to Xerox PARC, Bonnie McBride, the scriptwriter of Tron, basically made Alan the main character, and here he is in action. And actually, if you watch Tron, for the people who are familiar with the film, it's actually a metaphor for object-oriented programming. So watch it again with that in mind. And the main character, Tron, his actual username is Alan1, which was Alan's username at Xerox PARC, I believe. But we're not here to talk about Tron, unfortunately, although I'd like to. We're here to talk about the culture at Xerox PARC and the ARPA community that led to such a huge amount of innovation in a short period of time, and what we can learn from it. And on that note, I'm going to pass you over to our keynote speaker, Alan Cain.
I'll do it the hard way. So Jim asked me if I could talk about the internet and also about ARPA and PARC as he mentioned, and could I do it in just a couple of minutes, please? And of course my reaction was, well, okay. So here it is in 1 second. Because I actually like history, and this is the minimal, just for an exercise, I put down the minimal number of things that need to be talked about that got us to the internet and personal computing, and of course that's way too much. Yeah, so this is just not working. But this is. And this leads us to two ideas, which is, this old fortune teller says, I tell the future, nothing easier. It hasn't happened yet, so you can say anything you want. And by the way, if you're feeling creative, that's a good way to start. Just tell a future you'd like to see happen, and then you can make it happen. But she also asks, who can tell the past? And the reason the past is hard to tell is it happened in real time across an entire world. And what it means is any kind of compression of that past is almost certainly going to leave out something important, including, as Gerda pointed out, most of the people who actually participated in making something happen. And this is why we don't, in my research community, we have superheroes. They're like most valuable players in sports. But in fact, it's all of the stuff that we did was done by teams of various size. And so we try not to claim this got invented first and that got invented first. It actually doesn't work very well. For instance, most people here may not know, because in both America and the United States claim to have invented television. Most people don't know that the first television image ever put on a CRT was actually done in Japan in the early 20s by a Japanese guy. He understood what a CRT could be and made one that could show a television image. So having said that, we can start isolating different parts of this thing. For instance, this is the radar part of it, and British radar is on the left-hand side and American radar is on the right-hand side. The key idea here is there are a couple of really important people. Henry Tizard was the most important person. If you want to know who was most directly responsible for this country not being lost in the Battle of Britain, it was Henry Tizard. Because in the early 30s, he started worrying about Germany when Hitler came to power. He was a physicist, and he started poking at people, first looking for a death ray or a directed energy weapon, and the people he talked to said, well, that's too much power, but we might be able to detect planes coming. And so the result of that was long before, while Chamberlain was still appeasing and all of that, were a series of coastal stations all around the eastern part of this island, from the top of Scotland all the way down the bottom. And when the German planes came over, they were detected, and they could scramble the RAF to take care of them, and Britain wound up winning those battles. And radar also was the key technology for defeating submarines and night bombing. So it was the key technology that won the war for the Allies. And a lot of it happened here. The bosses of these two physicists let them do what they wanted, and they wound up inventing the cavity magnetron, which was the first electronic device that could actually put out enough power at a small enough wavelength to make even the detection of a periscope of submarine possible. And Tizard, again, got together with Vannevar Bush in the United States, and Tizard convinced the British government that the secrets that Britain had, instead of being bartered with the Americans, they should just give them all to us and expect that goodwill and trustworthiness would take care of everything else. And he was completely right. So it just cut through an enormous amount of bullshit that you would see in almost any other time. And the magnetron was brought to the United States, and that set up this enormous research and development effort at MIT that made almost all of the radars that were used in World War II, which were manufactured by American companies and distributed. And this was set up in part by having British scientists come over there. And there's one other little benefit at the very end of the war that Bush had been thinking about. How do you organize all of this stuff? And he thought everybody who dealt with knowledge should have a desk like this, a desk that holds the equivalent of maybe 10,000 books worth of stuff. It has scanners, has pointing devices, has hyperlinks. This was called Memex. Does this look familiar today? Okay, so this is 1945, and many of the inventors of the stuff that we have today read what Bush wrote in 1945. So this is an image of something that everybody wanted to have, and people started looking to find out about it. Okay, British computing, Turing, of course, going all the way up to Babbage and Ada at the top. Bletchley Park, which they couldn't talk about, but in fact the people at Bletchley Park remembered what they did, and that led to a number of computers, particularly the Manchester computers. And the Brits were way ahead of the Americans during the late 50s and the early 60s, and unfortunately you let IBM in, and they kind of bought out all the good stuff that was being done over here. And as part of our story, we could just as well, in 1969, and should be, celebrating Don Davies, the National Physical Laboratory Network, because that started working in 1969 also. And the people working on networking were friendly. The US got more of the credit than it deserved in a way, because there are the resources to develop the stuff into the internet and make it larger. But intellectually, it was kind of an even-Steven thing. And there was a wonderful character by the name of Louis Poussin in France who was also instrumental. And here's Peter. We'll hear from him a little bit later. He had a lot to do, and I'm hoping he will tell the VAT story. What Jim calls ARPA is basically open-ended government research in the public domain, most of which was ARPA. So this is a little bit too complicated to talk about, and here's Xerox PARC. He said a few words about that. Xerox PARC was really an integral part of this community. Everybody at Xerox PARC had gotten their PhDs paid for by ARPA, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And this whole thing started out because this one guy, Licklider, said early on, computers are destined to become interactive intellectual amplifiers for everyone universally networked worldwide. So he said that in 1962. And he got money from the government because they liked him, and he started all of these things happening. Now, if we look at just the network aspects here and combine the British and the American, we get something that's a bit like this, that in the 50s, there were air defense systems done in the US that had displays and pointing devices on them. Licklider saw those and said what he just said. He decided to fund MIT to make a computing utility because this wartime system was the kind of thing that pretty much everybody could make use of. It was networked together. There were 25 different places. And that led Lick to say, well, we need an intergalactic network. We want to connect up everything. And that got the romance that turned into the internet started. And Len Kleinrock, never been called Leonard in his life, from New York. So it'd be Lenny. In California, he's called Len. He did some important early work showing that you could queue messages without congestion. He did not invent packets, but his messages were like what packets eventually came to be. And packets were invented more or less independently by Paul Barron and Don Davies, one in the US and one in the UK. And this led to two networks, the ARPANET and NPLNet. And as was mentioned, then in a wonderful network called the LOANet, which dealt with the problem of how do you have the University of Hawaii work over all the islands back in the days when telephones were incredibly expensive. And the idea is, well, you broadcast it into the air. And Xerox PARC took that idea and made the Ethernet because a coax cable is actually like what you broadcast radio. If you broadcast radio inside of a cable, you can do something like a LOANet. And then, as was mentioned, these two networks were connected for the first time in 1973 that Peter had a lot to do with. And then there are a lot of work on internetworking. What we're celebrating today actually is not internetworking. We're celebrating a packet networking in both places. And we can celebrate internetworking in a few years. But why not celebrate it now also? So PARC had its own internet, little known fact, and worked on it, and many people worked on it. And then there was the SRI bread truck. What is this doing here? And I'll show you right now. So in 1976, this is an outdoor beer garden near the Stanford campus out in the woods, still there, called Rosati's. And in October, this bread truck, which inside had a couple of PDP-11s and radio transmitters, and it had a Mickey Mouse phone. And the reason they had this is so they could prove to the people in Washington that it was using a standard telephone. So this is maybe the first voice over IP. And the connection was a radio net link into the Bay Area packet radio network going to SRI and then across the country on the ARPANET to the East Coast. And why were they at this beer garden? Well, of course, so they could drink beer while doing their monthly report. So here they are with a teletype machine quaffing the golden liquid, trying to figure out what it is that they should tell to the government sponsors at the other end. I happened to be there for this, and everybody had a very merry time that day because it all worked. So this is an early example of internetworking because it had to go through a bunch of different networks in order to get to Washington. And maybe the date we really celebrate as the start of the internet was the next year in 1977, which also involved the bread truck, and it also involved things that Peter did over here to connect up several networks together by satellite. Well, there were these sponsors. So in the US, we have a Congress and we have the Pentagon. And the Russians gave us a gift in 1957, which is to get Americans to do things for the only reason they do them, which is they were scared. By the way, that's what happens over here. So if you are interested in why all this stuff happens at some times and not others, it's because regular people don't want to do anything with boffins unless they're terribly scared, because they really don't want to deal with unusual people. It's only when there's a real threat of war that they start looking for unusual people to try and find more ways out of the dilemma. So Sputnik caused ARPA to be created. And in the 60s, the 4 ARPA directors were these guys. The first one of those funded a Licklider over here, and then a line of one guy every 2 years through the 60s. And of course, Congress wasn't as bad as our Congress is now, but how is this relevant? Tell me why this work that you're doing at ARPA is relevant to the Department of Defense. Why are you spending this money? And what these guys would say, these guys are all scientists. They weren't administrators. These guys were all scientists. So what they would say is, oh, that's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, how is this going to help the United States or this technology or our society or our culture generally? That's the question if you ask us those questions, we'll tell you. And Bob Taylor, who was a bystander there, said these ARPA directors would stand up to these guys and in a polite, civilized way attack their myopia because these ARPA directors were scientific statesmen. And he says, we have had too few of these people in that job since then. And an example that's relevant to our story today is that in '66, Charlie Hertzfeld asked Bob, well, what do you want? And Bob said, well, this network is what I want to do, and here's why. And Hertzfeld said, okay, you got it. And that conversation was a 15-minute conversation. And then Hertzfeld said, well, how much money do you need to get this thing going? And Bob said, well, about $1 million, which is about 6 million pounds today. If you give us 6 million pounds, we'll get it organized and off the ground. And Hertzfeld said, okay. And Bob said, there was no ARPA order written or anything for months, maybe even a year. They just started doing it and started spending this money. That is how the internet got started. Imagine trying to do that today. Imagine how many reasonable people would be put in the path of progress. And when the Vietnam War started shutting this funding down, Taylor went to find other funding, which he found at Xerox, and he set up Xerox PARC. And so this is the lineage of the people who made our technologies today possible, not just the internet, but also personal computing. And if you want to read about this, there's a website, the website of this meeting that we have, and you can just go to internet@50.com, and there's a link to the Alan Kay references. So I have downloadable stuff and references to read about this. Nobody should escape the next few months without reading about the Tizard mission of radar in this country. This is the book about ARPA and Xerox PARC. And there are some documents also on the website that are written at the time. For instance, one of the great books of all time is this book written in 1953 about British computing. So if you want to know what was going on in 1953, this book has papers by everybody who is important. It has a paper by Turing. It has a paper by Christopher Strachey. It has papers by the Manchester people. It's got a paper in there by Maurice Wilkes, my old hero. Just a great thing. I have to promise myself not to digress. So if you're interested in this stuff, go there and read this. Okay, now I want to talk about the problem that most people have today in dealing with the past. It's not just the old fortune teller problem. The problem is that the words that we use today were used in different ways in the past. And so when we learn about something in the past, or when we see something in the past, we tend to evaluate it in terms of the present. And a good example of this, and a great complaint, what happened when Engelbart, who's known as the inventor of the mouse and other things, died. The modern-day Engelbart wrote a great obituary. And here's the most telling thing. He said, when I read tech writers' interviews with Engelbart, I imagine these writers interviewing George Orwell and asking in-depth probing questions about his typewriter. That's the problem. The mouse was nothing. It just happens to be visible. It's the invisible stuff that you have to look at. Similarly, the shopping list thing, well, yeah, it had hypertext, shared screen, collaboration, blah, 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 blah. And as Brett Victor says, the flaw is you don't want to treat the past as like today, except cruder. That assumes that today is some refinement of the past. In fact, in many, many cases, what we have is a much cruder present from a much more refined past. And if we had more time, I would demonstrate this to you in ways that would astonish you. And the reason this is true is because Engelbart was special, and almost nobody who followed him was as special. So we got these special ideas early on from this genius. And Engelbart himself said, hey, the mouse, that's just a button on the radio. We invented a whole car. You're spending all this time worrying about some knob on the radio. They showed some of it. Okay, so the problem with invention and even innovation, which is just something incremental on something that's already known, is people don't even reinvent the wheel. They reinvent the flat tire. And if you don't know about wheels, this sort of works, right? Have you ever had a flat and had the drive on it? Anybody? Sort of works. And if you don't know about something better, you might think that's what a wheel is. Similarly, a full glass of water holds a half glass. And so for the creature that's comfortable in the half glass, the creature can swim in that, but also has the opportunity to go up to the top there. But if you only give the half full glass out, that creature has no opportunity to explore the top and might start thinking that that's reality. So a very important thing to understand about today is that in many important respects, normal has been redefined downward. So the things we take to be normal today in many ways are just shadows of better ideas in the past. And of course, people are curious about, I went on the net to see if people were curious about Orwell's typewriter, and boy, they are. Here it is. And because it's so much easier to talk about a typewriter than it is to wonder what he meant by this. So we really want to ask, what was he trying to accomplish? How did he go about it? And eventually we can get down to his typewriter. It actually is important, printing is important, but we have to go for the top ideas. And similarly, in the mid-50s, we had there were 25 centers in the US, each one of which had about 150 of these interactive terminals with pointing devices. Bet you didn't realize that. And they were all networked together. What this turned into, by the way, was our air traffic control system. Developed directly from this. Back then, it was the air traffic control system for Russian bombers. And we want to do the same kind of thing. What were these people actually thinking about? Because that's the typewriter. We want to know, what were they trying to accomplish? How were they able to make it happen? And eventually you can get down to some questions about the technology. So just a quick sample here. We saw what Bush was interested in with something like a super version of Wikipedia. The head of ARPA wanted to keep track of everything. Licklider was more lofty. He saw that the combination of humans and computers would think together as no humans have ever thought before. McCarthy looked at it and said, every home will have one. One of these. Every home will have one, because they thought of this as an information utility, like our power utility or our water utility or gas utility. Ivan invented computer graphics, which is used today, and Engelbart wanted to deal with humans' capabilities for dealing with complex, urgent problems, like the climate problem, like education, like energy, like water. Engelbart was a very serious guy, and this is what he wanted to do. And in this short talk, I'll just look at two of these things. So here's Licklider memo in 1963 to the members and affiliates of the Intergalactic Computer Network. They asked him, why do you call it intergalactic? And he said, well, engineers always give you the minimum. And I want a worldwide network, so I'm asking for an intergalactic one. And he said, if we make an intergalactic network, then our main problem will be learning to communicate with aliens. And this is an important idea. It's an idea that hasn't been grappled with in today's commercialization of the technology. That once you scale up, the most points in a scaled up network are going to be alien to you in a variety of ways. And one of the papers I put online for you to read is this paper called The Computer as a Communications Device. You'll find it very interesting because it is almost absent from the communication devices you're using at this very moment. Almost no good ideas are in the mobile phones that you have. So the key thing is, if you can't share context, it's hard to agree on something. So if the subject is a mane and hooves and tail, one person could be thinking of a horse and another of a zebra. They might agree on a hamburger. If you're trying to communicate with a computer, what shared context could you possibly have? What could you do with its thought cloud to get it to intersect with yours? if it's an AI, these are all illustrations, by the way, from this paper back then, and I've added a couple to them in the same style. So the salesman wants money. The computer is not too sure about what humans are, but knows to protect the boss. There's the problem of the chocolate and the apple, even inside our own heads. So we have this problem of humans and groups communicating with themselves, to each other individually, and groups as one example of alien problems. Once we add computers in, we've got the problems of human communicating with computers. That's the user interface problem. We've got the problem of different computers communicating with each other, both in hardware and software. That's half of what the internet tried to work on. And then we have real aliens that we should think about every once in a while. What does that mean? Now, important idea here is that one of the ways we help to communicate with ourselves and others is through media. And so we can put media on the computer, but as soon as we do, the biggest sin would be just to imitate the physical media that we've been using. That is the number one problem with these devices that you have. They are all conveniences for media that happened before. You know, they're all about movies, they're all about recordings, they're all about photographs, they're all about text. All the things that people have gotten used to that you can sell without a learning curve are in the normal of today. Almost everything that's important about computers has been left out of the normal. And so if you think that what you're doing is just normal reality, you're missing entirely what the computer is all about. And in fact, what these guys were all about. So here they are collaborating on something important like making a bridge, designing it, testing it. And this cartoon was taken from an actual meeting of the Engelbart group because their system was so important to them and the sharing was so deep in their system. For instance, no matter what you did in the Engelbart system, any number of people could get in there and they each had their cursors. So it wasn't a sharing cursor, it wasn't just seeing a picture, you were actually all able to interact on the same stuff and to communicate about it. They thought about what are tools. So here's a simple tool that goes right to something that's genetic in humans. If it doesn't work, bash it. So her goal, this is what Engelbart called an A process. And the B process is improving her A process. She's getting better at hitting these things. And an important thing to understand about tools is they actually train us while we're using them. She's thinking more and more hammer-like thoughts. As an adult, she might think of using a nuclear weapon on somebody. It's a natural thing. If people don't do what we want, hammer them. The favorite hammer of today is starting to be AI. So think about how dangerous this is to have a Pleistocene brain with nuclear weapons. Well, most people don't worry about this today, but these guys did. But there are also inward tools. So here's a tool that actually changes her perceptions. And again, we can use an agent, a servant, to do things for us. That gives us a view of the world. But we can also use an agent to help our internal growth, use a teacher. We can hammer people, affect people through teaming, but we can also put teams together to grow. So all of these things I'm telling you here were things that were thought about back then. And of course, what they thought about is, what, with these modes of use, what if we replace parts of it with computers now? And what does that mean in terms of communication? What does that mean in terms of agencies? So if we take that idea and this Engelbart meeting, here's what they thought of, is that this diagram, which is the one that we have today, humans controlling powerful agencies, is not what you want. You have to include education, the thing that doesn't happen today. And with that, you can use new methods, you can use new languages, and you've created a system that includes the human. This is what Engelbart meant by augmentation. He didn't mean just adding a tool. And that system is kind of a thinking unit, and if you put together a group collaborating, you're putting together groups of these. So this is a big idea. Almost nobody who reads about Engelbart reads far enough to understand that this is what they're driving at. I think this might help some of the discussions later on in this meeting. Okay, so I hate bullet lists, so I'll just mention a couple here. So why did this stuff work? Well, the funders funded visions, not goals. They didn't think they were wise enough to pick goals. What they wanted to do is to put out a vision and let different people find different ways of realizing the vision. They didn't want to fund just problem solving, because if you make up a problem from the current context, it's probably not the problem you should put your work into. You need to find problems. They paid money for that. Fund people, not projects. The top people are the ones that are going to make a difference. Only fund the very best people because they're qualitatively different than the next levels down. And this is a long-term venture, so part of our research results have to be the next generation researchers. And ARPA was one of the few groups ever to build in a very large amount of money to create the next generation of researchers. Every researcher at Xerox PARC had been created by ARPA. I was the oldest one there, and I was 30. Butler Lamson, who was the Oppenheimer of PARC, was only 27, and Taylor at PARC was only 38. So you need unusual people, but this is the least thing to worry about, because they're just way out in the bell curve, and if you have a couple of $100 million to choose from, if you want a championship football team, get Beckham. If you want Xerox PARC, get Butler Lamson in this case. And who knows how rare they are, but if you need 1 in a million, there's going to be 200. If you need 1 in 10 million, there's going to be 20. You can find these people. Xerox PARC was only 25 researchers. Only 25. You can find them. The problem is you can't find the funders. So what did these guys look for? Well, they were just trying to get the best people who are interested in this and let them do their thing. The people you want to get also want to choose their own problems and methods, sure, because they're artists. They want to work on their own conceptions of the problems. Taylor said, my job is to organize things so that when the lone wolves need to cooperate, they will. And he was very successful at that.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy.
Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream.
So the important thing about this is the way management thinks about dealing with these top researchers. It's completely wrong. 100% wrong. Couldn't be more wrong if you tried. But the only thing, they think that their job is actually to manage, to control. And you can't control cats. But here's a much younger set of research funders who really understand.
We have a jar filled with all the names of the toys we have sitting right next to us. And we're gonna take from the jar one by one and open up these toys.
Alright.
Would you like to go first, picking something from the jar?
Yes.
All right. What is
Mouse on a spring.
it? Ooh, I like this one. All right.
Mouse on a spring.
It's inside this box, right here. So there's this little mouse on a spring, and it's going up and down, and our cats are going to try to catch it.
Alrighty.
Our cats really like having mouses, but they keep on tearing them apart because they're kind of vicious, so we got another one. Okay, I got it, and this is the toy. It's a little mouse, it goes on a spring like that. George is already interested. He's just like, what is this? What is this mysterious item?
George.
So easy if you actually understand who you're dealing with. So here's why this stuff worked. This is the number one reason here. Because a great vision is not a set of goals. A vision has to be non-specific enough. It has to be romantic, but it has to be something that can be filled in by the people who hear the vision. And Licklighters, as I mentioned, was computers are destined to become interactive intellectual amplifiers for everyone universally networked worldwide. He tied that to a magnet and he hit it over the horizon. And it attracted hundreds of iron particles in different places. They all pointed to north. They didn't know what north was, and neither did Licklighter. But they all got to north. So the number one principle here is the goodness of the results correlates most strongly with the goodness of the funders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Fantastic. I think we've all got slightly smarter as a result of listening to you speak. I think we'll do questions at the end. I'm sure lots of you have got questions for Alan, but we'll get the next speaker on and we'll do the questions at the end. We're lucky enough not only to have one pioneer of the internet in the room, but two. We've got Peter Kirstine, who Alan referred to. I think we're going to play the film first. Yeah. And I was lucky enough to interview Peter last month, so we're going to play a short film now of that interview, and then Peter's going to come on stage. We're going to have a bit of a chat, and he's going to give us his observations on why the internet, why ARPANET was so successful so quickly. So I'm just going to play the. Worked in rehearsal.
In something like 1970, the ARPANET was starting to work, and was starting to work well. If you looked at the Salt Band Treaty, there were lots of small seismic arrays. Large ones, there were only 3. One was in Alaska and one was in Norway. If you look at the map, you'll see the reason for the Norwegian one was it was obviously very close to the Soviet Union. So DARPA put some money into that particular array getting larger. For obvious reasons, it had a leased line to Washington just for seismic monitoring. Larry Roberts had the bright idea that since the ARPANET was working, and since he wanted computers on the ARPANET with applications, why not take this 2.4 kilobit line and link it to Washington? Then, since he knew about what was happening in London with Donald Davies, he had another good idea. The way one went between Washington and that array in Norway was to take a satellite to Gunhilly and then a mixture of landlines and underwater to Norway. Well, if you're going to arrive in London in any case, surely it must be straightforward to interrupt the line, have it connect yet another machine, namely something or other, the NPL, and go on to Norway. And so why not propose that the three of them linked together? You really would then have proper applications to different networks and really do something very, very interesting. And so you proposed that. Unfortunately, that was the time that the British were trying to get into the common market. 5 years earlier, they'd wanted to get to the other European activity which preceded the common market, and General de Gaulle said no. This time, the Heath government wanted to have Britain join the common market. The reason that de Gaulle said no was because we were too closely linked with America and too weakly linked with Europe. Therefore, the Heath decided that he did not wish to accept the offer to link to the US and didn't allow Donald to accept the offer. Larry had met me before. He knew me. He knew that I knew both Europe, that particular sort of technology, knew the US, and I was the logical person to offer it next. I was interested. I'd heard about it. I would have loved to have working on my research in the university to do it. So I said, I had no money, of course. I'd love to accept it. So he made me the offer. I then applied to money from our research councils. They thought it was nonsense to do for one particular reason. For internal political reasons, the ARPANET had been said to be an experiment. The people in Britain doing things didn't deal with experiments. They dealt with services. And so if this thing was an experiment, they would not back a research proposal to connect into it. They wanted only to connect into a proper service. But Donald Davies, who did know me, and who was allowed by himself to issue a grant or contract or whatever it was for £5,000, offered me £5,000 to do my research. I knew people very senior in the post office, and they knew me, and they offered to pay for a line from London, UCL, to Norway for 1 year. Therefore, I was able to accept the offer, and the project started, and the rest is history.
So just while Peter gets himself on stage, I mentioned at the beginning that Peter Kirstine was the first person to put a computer on the ARPANET outside the US in 1973. He also worked with Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf, defining and implementing the Internet Protocol suite. And I think he might have been at the other end of the line when we saw that bread van earlier, and Alan was having a beer in Zotz. Peter was on the other end of the line. I don't know if he was having a beer or not, making sure that the message got through. Okay. He also put the Queen online in 1976, gave her an email address, and he's been the mainstay of the UCL Computer Science Department for the last 50 years. And I think he set up the UCL Computer Science Department.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah.
Not that chair. Ignore that chair.
Right.
That's fine, you can sit there, Peter. Peter's actually still a professor at UCL. I think he's retiring in the near future, but he's not retired yet. An inspiration to us all.
Couple of weeks. It's about time.
So I've got a few questions for you, Peter, if you wouldn't mind answering them. Firstly, I'm sure it wasn't an easy thing to do technically, put a computer on the ARPANET outside of the US, but I believe politically it was also difficult. We talked about the fact, Alan talked about the fact that problem finding and problem funding is something that went out of vogue in the early 70s. I think it was the same situation in the UK as it was in the US. And they wouldn't, as you said in the video, they wouldn't, the Science Research Council wouldn't fund your initial project. It didn't tick the right boxes. But you didn't let that bother you. You found ways around it. You got £5,000 off Donald Davis. Larry Roberts gave you a lease line from the US, and the post office gave you a lease line to Norway. Just wondered if you could say, what is it about your personality or the circumstances that allowed you to find a way around this lack of funding?
Well, I think the important part is to just try to do things with as small a group as possible, a smaller number of people as possible, because then you can make decisions fast. And that was absolutely vital. You didn't want to spend long periods of time setting up projects. You wanted to do it quickly.
So you're able to cut through the bureaucracy with the minimum amount of fuss.
Yeah.
I think there must be something about your personality as well, just making things happen rather than just accepting defeat. I was wondering, what was your motivation? Why were you so motivated? What were you trying to do in those early days?
I wanted to see collaboration happening. And the big problems around that time was there was an awful lot of communications nationally, an awful lot of in Britain, for example. And if everybody was allowed to use a link, then you couldn't restrict it to the people who you wanted to see collaborate with people elsewhere. So that was one of the reasons one tried to actually make sure that as few people as possible were allowed to use the link across the Atlantic, so that you could restrict yourselves to those who you wanted to see collaborate. And the collaboration was the thing which one wanted to try to see happen.
Okay. So part of that collaboration involved persuading Larry Roberts to send you a £50,000 computer from the US to the UK for free. But then you were met with a slight problem in that I think you were charged import duty, which was 10% at the time, which was the £5,000 that Donald Davis had given you.
Well, that was exactly the problem. The trouble is that supposedly there was going to be no charge when things were imported, but then there was suddenly a charge. So that was going to take all the money I had. So I said to them, well, I would pay it if I have to, but let me bring this thing in now for free. I will appeal the charge, and then you have a few years to think about it. They permitted me to do that, and so I could get the project started, and still had a little bit of money to actually hire people to do the work.
And it actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise, didn't it, this VAT problem?
Yes. Because the next thing that happened was I made my appeal and heard 2 or 3 years later, 3 or 4 years later, I think, that my appeal had been refused. And that was fairly soon after, and that I would have to pay the money after all. At this stage, I was again rather said, no, don't pay, just to the university. And the university didn't know me well. And I said, don't pay, I will appeal again. And this time I appealed again and said that if they insisted on their money, I would export the equipment to the US and re-import it under the Defense Research Collaboration, and then they couldn't do anything about it. Well, they didn't want universities to start working with defense, so they called me in to the Treasury. And I wasn't entirely truthful, because by that time I had money from quite a lot of people in the British government. And when asked, was what I was doing of any interest to anybody in Britain, I said no, it was only of interest to the US. And they went through a whole list of, so in the end, they decided I wouldn't need to pay the money and could keep control of the project. Now, this was important because I wanted to be able to decide, or at least get to be able to limit who could use these links so to make the collaboration possible. And thanks to that, I was able to do that.
And it meant for a decade, I think, that you kept control of the project and nobody else wanted to touch it.
Well, on the contrary, they always wanted to touch it. But the point is, I had been allowed to import this stuff free of any duty. So if they were going to take it over, they would start having to pay lots of money to take it over. They didn't want to pay lots of money, so they let me keep control of it for quite a long time afterwards. And that was very useful, because then you could again make sure just the right sorts of people collaborated. And that was the end of what one was trying to succeed in doing.
So there's another story that I wouldn't mind you telling people. When I came to interview you at your house last month, you happened to mention that that was the very room that you believed the first password was put on the internet.
Well, yes, that was again the same sort of question, but from a different point of view. I realized it was going to be rather sensitive to have people in Britain communicate with the US, and I wanted to, again, restrict the number of people who could do so. So I actually I had a small computer attached to mine, which was used for much of my research. And I found that when one first tried to get onto this network, one had to press a certain button, or one of various buttons, and that would tell them which terminal it was, and therefore how one communicated. Well, it took about a second or two to work out what was happening. And I could seize the link during that period. And I put on a password. And by putting on a password, one could again limit who could use the network. I put this on, and shortly after that, there was a visit from all the people who'd invented, who had actually developed this network. And they tried to get in and found they couldn't get in. Well, they couldn't understand this because they knew they hadn't put any passwords on. But I had put the password on, and therefore they couldn't actually use it until I told them how they could use it. And that was, as far as I know, the first security ever put onto the network. It wasn't that the Americans didn't know how to do it, but it was going to be politically so difficult for them to do it. They never did.
And that was just one password, a universal password. And I believe 10 years later, you introduced individual passwords.
Well, that was for a different reason. 10 years later, there were lots of people now, of course, using all these networks. And the question was, who was going to pay for it? And for that, they wanted to know exactly who is using it. So at that stage, I started giving different passwords to different people, and or different groups rather than people. And therefore one could tell who was going to be used, and therefore who should be charged for using. And that was the important part of it. By that time, charging had come in, and people didn't want to pay too much money for things.
And you got a lot of hate mail as a result, I believe.
Yes.
So we've not only got the pioneers of the internet, we've got one of the pioneers of cybersecurity in the room. I'm not going to dwell on the subject we heard about earlier, the fact that we were seen as being too close to the Americans, and that's why Donald Davies wasn't allowed to join the ARPANET, and you got the chance. But I just wondered if you had anything to say about the political intervention and the government's view of what you were doing.
Well, the really important thing, it's better to have small groups of people who make decisions, preferably one, who can make decisions fast. That's absolutely vital. I remember in one of my early meetings with Larry Roberts, he said, I've suddenly decided to put in $8 million into voice. And there was some quite senior people at dinner in my place, and they were shocked that one person could decide to put in $8 million. And again, it's this able to make fast decisions, which is so absolutely vital for getting projects started quickly. I think that's the main thing I'd like to say about all that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter Kirstine.
Okay.
Our next speaker is Eva Pascoe, serial digital entrepreneur. Set up the first internet cafe here in London in 1994. Set up a think tank, Cyber Salon in 97. Was one of the first e-commerce directors, in fact, the first e-commerce director for the Arcadia Group, setting up the shopping portal Zoom. Is still an e-commerce expert and consultant, specializing in Shopify. Working on a digital bill of rights and all kinds of things. I think she's a trustee for Help for Heroes, very busy lady. And Eva Pascoe now is going to tell you about the early years of the web and what happened to the internet when the web emerged. Eva Pascoe.
Hello, everybody. It's so really lovely to be here. So many familiar faces. We've been at it for quite a long time, so we gathered very, very amazing people as friends and family. So it's just so nice to see you, and thank you very much to Jim for getting us together. Some people from various continents, some people from Milton Keynes, which is sometimes quite as far. And I just want to have, we're really a footnote at the bottom of the giants before. But I wanted to talk about today about what happens when all these bits of cable met real people. So I'm Eva, I'm from Poland. I came here about 1986, just after Chernobyl, because I was absolutely convinced that the Russians were going to get us. And they were going to get us because they couldn't deal with interfaces. So I had this mission to improve the world and save the world from bad interfaces. Because as we discovered, Chernobyl issue was a human error. And we thought we can solve it. So I got myself into Birkbeck College, to study human-computer interfaces and save the world. And then I discovered, actually, that it wasn't really that possible at that time, because everything was text-based technology and really difficult. But I was very lucky, because Birkbeck was next door to UCL, and there's many of you today from UCL, and we were able to steal all the best professors and actually learn quite a lot really quickly. So I started doing this PhD in human-computer interfaces for nuclear power stations, which was kind of not really happening, because I realized that it was really a career graveyard. Nobody was bringing any new nuclear industry. It was like just complete dead end. So I kept staring and thinking, like, it's not going to happen here. And I got myself so far, and I was going to, sit somewhere in the cul-de-sac of science, developing things for the nuclear stations, and nobody was building. So I started looking around, what else could I do with this knowledge of interfaces? And then I landed on the internet. Obviously, being in Berwick, we had the best connection because we inherited the nodes from UCL, and I had, early Telnet, early FTP, early everything. So we were very familiar with the process. But what I noticed at some point is that people started doing emotional things online. So my colleagues who were doing PhDs, very bored. We were all very bored. At the end, it's a horrible process. For those of you who've done PhD, I can see some there. It's a very, very long and horrible process. So at the end of the day, we were just emailing anybody about anything. And some of us fell in love online with people who we never met, and there was definitely love in the air. And I kind of think, like, this is really interesting. How come that we actually can engage so deeply and so emotionally with people, a couple of universes away, who we haven't met? So at that point, I started thinking, okay, let's maybe bring that beautiful cyberspace and what we can do for the universities to the real people. So we sort of moved it from cyber street to high street. And I had a couple of ideas how to go about it. So I was Polish, and I had my family in Poland, and the only one way I could communicate with them was this. So this was the landline. My mother didn't even have a landline. She had to go to the neighbors to call me. And we had the phone boxes, which were horribly expensive. So the whole business of being away from home, painful. So email was the solution, and if it was a solution for me, I knew it would be the solution for everybody else. So Siberia was pretty much the answer to that. But it didn't come together easily because it was the recession, 15% interest rates, 11% unemployment. Nobody would lend us any money, ever. So we basically did a rent, friends and family. We had few side hustles before, and we just chucked this money at Siberia. We really painted it ourselves. There's quite a few people who really I'm very grateful for because that was built together on a shoestring out of nothing in about 6 weeks. But lo and behold, we opened on 9th of September, 1994, equipped with Mosaic, FTP, and Telnet. And we thought we were just the shit. So we opened it up, and I had, as you could see from all these lovely maps from my wonderful predecessors, it was all kind of very maily scene there. And when I was making my way through the computer interfaces, I kind of felt like, is this just me here? Where's all the other women? Nobody. And it was a shock to me because I was from Poland. All my maths teachers were women. All our programmers were women. That's what people did. Valentina Tereshkova was quite good on old tech. So I was quite shocked that it wasn't the case here. And I thought, let's fix it. It can't be that hard. So we opened that, and my little idea was to run Siberia as a center for women and computing. So we wrote something on business plan. I got together a couple of wonderful partners. There was 4 of us co-founders. And we opened Siberia, and it was all very well, except, on the first day, we had the queues 3 deep around the building, but they were all blokes. So that was a business plan that never really worked. But slowly, we started addressing it. But it was quite sort of Boise stuff. So, all the time what we were actually doing online was, falling in love and playing games and chatting shit. And it was all just kind of not really women environment, put it that way. I was a nerd, so I was comfortable with that. But I didn't feel that women were really getting it. So we kind of moved on. It was quite hard work, because something that Wendy Grossman, my sort of cyber sister, said to me that in the early internet, people didn't come to the internet with their physical friends. You had to be pretty mad to be on it in the first place, and you were meeting other mad people online. Your normal friends and family were not really invited, because just to set up a modem, it needed a PhD. So the initial friends online were friends somewhere else. Well, we wanted to change it. We still like the sort of, dystopian, cyberpunky feel, but we wanted to change it. So our idea was to bring friends who are physical friends and do stuff together. So slowly, we started sort of filling in the whole building. So as you can see, we had Siberia on the ground floor. On the first floor, I had my little office. Then on the second floor, we had EasyNet, who were our partners in crime. So it was the second internet provider in UK, which I will talk about later. And on the top floor, we had people like Siberia Dating. We developed these pages for Siberia Dating, very popular. Siberia Jobs, except there were no any jobs online because nobody wanted to pay us. And we had also the idea of Siberia recording, digital recording. So I think we practically invented Napster, except around 7 years too early. And also digital payment. We had digital cash. Again, two decades too early. So we probably were sitting on sort of like Bitcoin stuff, except, early. But the whole building was like a little co-working space with a party space upstairs. So on the roof, we had a party scene, and I was always shitting myself because people were drinking a lot, and it was the ravers' time. I don't even know what pills people were popping, but there was a lot of pills around. So I was always thinking, this roof terrace, which is going to get arrested. But the whole building was like a complete hub of creativity. If you went in, I don't know how many times per day I was accosted by someone that, I've got this great idea. If you only did this and that and added the internet, it would be amazing. Right. A lot of them were amazing, but it was just a bit early. But we slowly started succeeding with getting sort of less nerdy people in. And because it was I came from the internet scene where everybody understood everything. But obviously a lot of people who came didn't really hack this, V-line editors for email. So I had this idea of putting everything in a U-shape structure so people could help each other. So it wasn't really great because a lot of people wanted to do their little private things and they didn't want us to see what they were doing, if you get my gist. But we said, no, we're not doing that here. You can do it if you get your modem, if you're good enough to set up from home, you do these things at home. In Siberia, we do nice things. But we put these computers next to each other so people could help each other, and once somebody got stuck on some installation on FTP or something, they could always poke the neighbor and say, how do you do that? So we didn't have to provide help to everybody. We did have help. We called them cyber hosts, and they were mainly cyber hostesses because we were still cyber feminists. We were even called cyber harlots, so it was getting hardcore. And they were helping people how to do it. So, it was terribly stylish. A lot of people today, younger kids, are asking me, this Siberia cafes, we have some in Lewisham. That's where poor people send money home. I said, no, it wasn't like that. You couldn't send money home because there wasn't nothing to send money over. But we also were terribly stylish. I have terrible taste, as you know. I even wear nerdy jackets. But my co-founder, Jenna, had an amazing sister who actually was interior designer. And she designed our interior. I didn't even know we had interior, but we had interior. So she cut out this lovely little shapes and kind of encouraged people to huddle together and help each other with the very stylish metal chairs. It was all very metallic-y and dystopian, but it was really, really nice. So the early internet cafes were not dingy. They were very beautiful. But they still had a lot of boys around, and they were always very welcome, but we wanted girls. So I set up quite quickly a bunch of training courses for women. So this was in sub-Siberia, because we discovered we had a basement, we had a cave, and that cave was converted into kind of more jazzy scene. And all these girls on the picture, although you can't see the faces, but they all went to have amazing internet careers, and I'm terribly proud of them. But this was my kind of early cyber harlots crew. So we taught women how to use internet, and it was quite interesting because the web gave us pictures. Every day today, everybody takes lots of pictures as you go through the day. Imagine that was not possible. You could not take a picture of anything because there were barely any digital cameras. That's the reason why we'd hardly have any pictures from those times, because digital camera was like, I knew someone who had a digital camera. People had no way of taking pictures in any obvious way. So we thought, okay, we start from photography, and we started off trying to teach women how to create beautiful pages. So Louvre came online, and it really saved me, because Louvre has put kind of like open license a lot of pictures that we could use for training and for the setting up own pages. So we realized that women really wanted to do visual stuff, and the web was just about getting there. It was still very slow if you build your own page with lots of pictures like for the internet, but you know, there were pictures. So our contribution to the visual was to let people build their own dating pages, their own gallery pages, and basically making it look like something. We were also terribly global, and this is because I got fed up with everybody constantly asking, so what's the time in New York? Can I send this email? Will they see it? Forgetting the email was asynchronous anyway, but eventually we just put these clocks on, and we were very proud of them. Now you see the clocks everywhere, but they were actually very useful because people were just learning how to operate in the multi-time zone. That was quite early time. And then eventually these clocks, you now see them everywhere, but I think we were the first to have them. And then it kind of got bigger as the net has been developing. We got this award with Jeanette here, my partner, for, I don't know, something or other. They didn't even know what we got it for, but I think it was coffee and computers. And that gave us a little bit of funding. So then we moved on to places like Cyber Center. We set up Siberia and Centre Pompidou. We were the first British company ever, and I think the last one that Centre Pompidou invited. And they were a bit confused because I was Polish, my partner was South African, our architect was German, and it was all in Centre Pompidou, which is as French as it gets. So, but it was really, really interesting. One day I remember some guy rushed into Siberia with accordion and blood pouring out of him. I said, have you got email? Have you got email? So I said, yes. And he was on strike, as the French are usually on strike. And having accordion and a bit of blood dripping is just what people do. So we were cleaning him up, and he was sending these reports on email from this very cyber cafe. And then I realized it's just normal. That's what the French do. It's fine. Then we moved on to Bangkok, which was a very swishy place in Sukhumvit, where I learned another thing. Thai community didn't really like individual computing, so they all came in bunches, so it was like 5 or 6. And we had to develop this way of hanging the computers from the ceiling and being able to move them around, as everybody contributed a little bit to that email. So they kind of moved in groups, so we had to do the Siberia solutions in groups. And then one day, a small sweaty bloke came to the cafe on his bike and said, I think you need some merchandise. So I said, okay, we do need merchandise. Can you help us? Yeah, I think I can help you. So he designed these beautiful things for us, very, very sort of stylish and super exciting things like, you know, lime floppy disks. That was just cutting edge of streetwear. And turn up, that was Sebastian Conran. And I only discovered that after I got the invoice. I thought, ooh, okay, fine, we better start doing things properly. So he designed this, he was actually a big biking enthusiast, one of the early ones, and he designed these huge courier bags for us, which are now collector's items, and I've seen one on eBay for about £1,000. So if you see them, get them. So the reason why we actually managed to connect to anything in Siberia was EasyNet. So David Rowe and Keith Tier, who were then developing EasyNet, were competing with Demon, because that was the first ISP. But Demon was really hard work. You had to get the modem, set it up, spend hours trying to keep it up. So EasyNet was supposed to be for people who are less technically familiar. So you basically, you know, pop on your disk and off you go. Obviously, it wasn't like that. It was easier. So we always said that it should be called EasierNet, not EasyNet. But, you know, we can only try. And with them, we went for that whole big adventure, which led to all sorts of different avenues. So one day, this little girl came to Siberia. Next to us was Whitfield Street Recording Studio. We didn't even know it from the beginning, because we just ended up in this place by complete accident. But suddenly, this musician started coming, and this little girl comes and says, so what's this email about? How does it work? So I sat her down and said, it's Kylie Minogue. Right, okay. So we taught Kylie how to send an email. She was a technophobe. She was quite anxious about computers, but she got herself a Mac, and she kept coming through the process of recording in the studio. And by the end of it, she was actually completely competent, so respect. The same with U2, Annie Lennox, Dave Stewart, I think you name them. We basically explain the internet to everybody. Musicians got it early, and I think they got it early because they realized that following David Bowie announcement that this is going to be very shared medium, they realized they needed to be part of it. And also musicians are quite logical people. You know, music and music technology wasn't too far from what the internet was doing. So it was kind of a marriage of minds. And then Mick Jagger showed up and gave us money. So we took it. So he decided to invest in us for reasons only known to himself. Obviously never got anything back and never talked to me since. So, but we're very grateful. We also had dealings with BowieNet because David Bowie decided he was quite connected early on. He decided to run his own internet provider. Probably not the wisest idea, but he went quite far with it. And we were running this kind of connections. He was in New York typing in very deep and meaningful things, as he does. And we were just trying to survive and not lose connection on our end. And Gary Barlow, who was then probably at the peak of his fame, who had a plan to launch Barlow Internet. Again, he didn't because he realized actually quite hard work. And in the back of that, politically, the scene was getting kind of a little bit heated because I think Margaret Thatcher has been kicked out at that point, and John Major came. And what he did, he banned music called rave. He just decided to ban ravers and criminalized ravers in 1994 in November, just after we opened. And we couldn't quite understand what was his problem, but they were just absolutely scared of these kids from the north who would come down to London and run clubs and pop pills. I mean, today, everybody does it, no big thing. But at that time, John Major was a bit concerned. So we decided to help them out and help them to organize these raves and put ISDN to various places like Megatripolis or Heaven. Sometimes it didn't really work as well as we intended. So one day my girls were sent on an expedition to provide ISDN to one of these clubs. They came back saying, it was an S&M club. Is it the one we were supposed to be in? So you know, there were adventures, but that was kind of the background. So politically, it was quite cyberpunky and anti-authoritarian, not because we were particularly anti-authoritarian, but the environment was authoritarian, and we need to take a stand. And then we work with a lot of very, very radical artists. That was an early collage on very early Macromedia Adobe, because obviously, if there were pictures to be had, there were collages to be had. And Hannah Gall, who was artist in residence at Adobe, one of the first sort of real driver of Adobe tools, she was an Israeli soldier. So when she was not doing her Adobe pioneering, she was, cleaning the rifle and practicing the sharp shooting. So when you got to her house, you never knew what you were going to find there. So that was the kind of people we were working with. We also had very good connections with the Russians, with Russian artists, and that was a piece by Olya Lyanina about her boyfriend who came back from Afghan war, and it didn't go well. And that was the first interactive art piece, which is still online. You can see it. Olya now works in Frankfurt University and runs a very big archive of GeoCities, so it's definitely worth following her. But she was a really, truly explorative, interactive digital artist. But politically, we all thought that cyberspace will be independent. John Perry Barlow decided that this is going to be independent space, and we didn't want any government of it, and it was supposed to be a separate space for political space. At that time, it was possible, because as you remember this, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, and nobody did. You could advertise, but you had no idea who you were advertising for. So in some way, it was quite innocent space. There was no data, no personalization, nobody knew what was going on. You could get away with thinking that cyberspace will be independent. However, the party came to a rapid end on the innocence side because Louis Montulli invented cookies. And cookies allowed people to do good things, like shop, because it basically keeps permanent state and can allow you to hold your basket. But it also very quickly became a privacy challenge. So that was the point where it became commercial. About 1997, cookies were everywhere. And for a reason only known to themselves, Internet Engineering Task Lot decided to accept third-party cookies. So if you have any problems with what's going on today, blame the engineers, because they knew what they were doing and they accepted it. So and then it happened really quickly. So as soon as the cookies were, manageable and they delivered the shopping carts, Internet Bookshop was created. It was actually the first shop in UK that was functioning shop, and it very quickly was sold to W.H. Smith for 9 million. And then business decided, okay, this is an interesting space. But we decided that this space was getting dangerous. And at that point, Jim and people from Hypermedia Research Center and Siberia got together and started forming kind of lobbying group, not so much against third-party cookies, but for more regulations. And I felt a bit bad about it, because I was a big fan of John Perry Barlow, and the idea of having independent cyberspace was very attractive. But we realized that it's not going to be as easy as that. So we did a lot of work with CyberCell on basically bringing the digital education, but also linking up with Americans, thinkers about digital privacy, and ended up campaigning quite hard. I actually managed to get out of the office and campaign. Now I'm on the street every Saturday because of Brexit, but before we campaigned online. That's what one did. Well, now we started campaigning physically, and Tim Berners-Lee organized this web events where we were getting people to express their views about digital privacy, managed to get it to House of Commons with then Tom Watson, who was sponsoring it. And we were kind of on a good run with it. We even got John McDonnell to sign up for our Digital Bill of Rights, which, if it happened in 2015, would have stopped Cambridge Analytica. So, we were obviously not good enough to make it happen, but we were on the right track. But in parallel, I kind of got a little bit distracted into fashion, because I still couldn't get women online. We were having Siberias everywhere. We opened places with Richard Branson in Rotterdam, with some famous chef in Tokyo. I mean, there was loads of these things, but they were still very male places. So at some point, I decided to waltz off and do fashion, and hooked up with Topshop. And they gave me money to create Zoom. So that was basically early ASOS. So we had a multimedia portal with a multi-fashion approach, and I got women. So we launched the Zoom internet provider. I even have a disc. I have a disc. Which was very beautiful, designed to attract women. I had the best illustrators on the case. We worked on it with EasyNet underneath, so underneath Zoom was EasyNet, but we packaged in the way that kind of really looked very women-friendly, and that I had to work with people from Daily Mail, but that's another issue. And that was quite successful. We managed to get it just behind FreeSurf. FreeSurf was first, free internet, we were the second. And on the back of it, we created Topshop Online, first fashion shop online, probably 5 years ahead of Tesco. So quite hard work. Kate Moss somehow helped around. And then Philip Green came, so I had to go. So there's details of it in the bar after. But just to sum it up, that was a pretty interesting journey, and all the people here who were part of that journey, we were all mesmerized by it. We knew it was important. We knew it mattered. We're not quite sure why, but it changed my life. It changed many lives. And we were all like, from this movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. When you wake up one day and you just have to do something, and even if it costs you a job, and I pretty much lost my PhD on that one, you have to do it. And I think we all knew how important it was, and we still know how important it is. But I think we need to stop and think a little bit about what is important today and what was important originally. So when the guys were building the infrastructure, they were building it for military purposes, but it was also built imbued with certain values. So definitely resilience by having the distributed infrastructure, but also environmental positivity. We all thought that we all would be at home, not commuting, not polluting the environment, having remote life, and basically be all green. We also invested heavily in open source, an assumption of self-governance. But it didn't quite pan out that way. So when you look at it today, complete failure. Complete failure. I run a lot of shops, mainly with Shopify. You know, Shopify has put themselves on Google Cloud. In June, Google Cloud got down, and with the Google Cloud, everything gone down. So basically, we have the situation where we have distributed architecture. You guys got it right. What we don't have is distributed point of failures. We have basically AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, IBM, and you know the Chinese whatever they do with themselves. One hacker with a spare afternoon on the rainy Sunday can take the bloody lot out. That's where we are today. And I'm not joking. That's where we are today. It's completely centralized conceptually. So we are in a bigger risk than we have ever been. On that day, on 6th of June, all my customers lost connection for the whole day. All Gmail, all YouTube, 1 million Shopify shops. Can you imagine? That's more shops than London, New York, and Singapore put together. Not to mention Nest, you know, you couldn't get to the house, and Discord, because Google Cloud was down. And they gave some murky excuse, then congestion. Congestion on Sunday afternoon, really? It was a hack job, which we didn't want to admit. We wouldn't have cared. We wouldn't have given a flying rat's ass about it, but it's 80% of the cloud is in 4 hands. That's what we have. So the cloud is just like one cloud in 4 hands. And the second thing, much worse, unfortunately, is that it's a shitty, dirty little secret. We emit more CO2 than all the airlines put together. So your cuts, your pictures, your videos, whatever you do with yourself online, it all sits on coal. So when you look at Germany, you know, green Germany and the Germans here, one German server is equivalent to 10,000 servers on hydro-powered data centers. It is ridiculous. And it's so low and so hidden, people don't know about it. We started working about 4 years ago and trying to kind of look for the fixes and found out a very lovely little place with reindeers up in Sweden, which has a lot of dams, about 88 dams, which they built in 60s. And it's part of our kind of, you know, little piece of making it cleaner, better, greener, and easier. It's called Hydro 66, and it's part of Nordic Web. But honestly, to fix what we have done, you just have to boycott any of the clouds that are powered by coal, which is basically by everybody. What did work was open source. That's what you guys got right, and we just run with it. So basically LAMP, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. It's what everything runs on, including Wikipedia. We just have to keep investing into it, but it delivered, it delivers, it will deliver. And a company that everybody loves to hate, Facebook. We know that no elections are safe with Facebook around, we agree. But we also have to remember that Facebook gave us Arab Spring. So those of you to remember 2010, an Egyptian boy was dragged out of cyber cafe of all places and beaten up. I felt personally involved in that. He was dragged out of the cyber cafe. Like, why would you do that? So we stepped up and worked very hard on getting that protest going where everybody changed their pictures on the Facebook into the picture of this activist. And it was one of the Arab Spring kickoffs. So, you know, we all love to hate Facebook. Occasionally it does something good. And I think the recent wave of protests, which we're registering now in September, October, really a lot of that is done on Facebook. So yes, they shouldn't be carrying political advertising for sure. No election is safe with Facebook carrying political advertising. But without it, I think there'll be a lot less protests. So just to sum up, what was innovation yesterday, we take for granted today, and it's dark history tomorrow. But we have to be conscious of where we started from, and the guys built all the infrastructure, what they meant to be doing. Constantly ask ourselves if the roadmap is still valid, and also go and fix it, because, you know, internet is 50. I think in the internet years, you know, 25 years is equivalent to 1 human year. So basically, internet is 2. So internet is a toddler and just needs a lot of tough love, passion, patience, but technology will save us. It always does. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Ava. Inspiring as always. Now I've got Saj Huck, Plexal's own Saj Huck, who's going to bring us up to date. He's going to be talking about total connectivity and the challenges and the opportunities that it brings. And we're going to end on a positive, right? Right, Saj?
We are.
Yeah.
We are. I think we might just have to flick the slides. Sorry. So if I do that. Great. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I hope you've enjoyed the event. You know, it's a real privilege to speak up here after such esteemed speakers. I feel like a bit of an imposter, if I'm honest. But I wanted to pick up on a few threads before we start looking into the future. I love the way that Alan talked about how the original development of the internet was actually shaped by geopolitics and some of the kind of, I guess, sovereign concerns at the time. And that is not that too dissimilar to some of the challenges we face today. Likewise with Peter, I love the anecdote about the password. You'll be glad to know that we're starting to do away with those now and trying to eradicate them. And then Ava, it was great to hear about how you widened access to internet and you know, for everyday people, and also skills, knowledge, and all the things you're doing now. I wanted to thank Jim for the fact that he's been the absolute mastermind behind this event, and thank you for inviting us to participate, but also to my wider team at Plexal and Here East for putting on a great show as ever. So just a bit about LAWCA, because it's a bit of a funny acronym. What it stands for is the London Office for Rapid Cybersecurity Advancement. A very grandiose title, but effectively we have a big mission, that is to support the development of the most innovative cybersecurity capabilities and, by extension, companies in the UK and beyond, but specifically against some of the evolving challenges that our industry in the UK and globally as well face today. Effectively, the job of securing the UK is too big of one government, it's too big of one organisation, and therefore it needs a new model of collaboration, and that's what we're looking to do here. So with cybersecurity, we are very much embroiled in the future, because the real challenge for cyber today is there is a challenge about securing all of the capabilities that we have, all of the legacy systems that we have in place, but also we are on the precipice of huge change and huge disruption with the next wave of innovation which is about to emerge. But before we start talking about the future, I think just it's worth reflecting on 1969. I mean, it was a monumental year for innovation. There were, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated the momentous achievement of Apollo 11. And obviously, you know, the significance of those first moon landings. But also, latterly, on the 29th of October 1969, as you heard earlier, the achievement of ARPANET and that first machine-to-machine communication, I would argue, was actually the one which marked the true watershed moment for humanity. Because unlike the moon landings, which were, of course, the original moonshot, we knew when embarking on such an audacious attempt to do something world-changing, that should it succeed, it would be significant. However, with the internet and the development of that from its nascent form, nobody could have predicted what it's actually turned out to be today. It has, you know, it's created whole new industries, it's disrupted existing industries and eroded some completely, and it's also caused such disruption to everything from everyday life to business, to politics, in a way that nobody could have conceived 50 years ago. The internet has changed the way we access and retain information, how we think, how we communicate, how we collaborate. And we all can imagine, and we all know firsthand, the benefits of what the internet brings. To date, it has enabled everything from the, you know, changes to the way we move around cities, to remote surgery, for instance. And this all stems from this singular innovation. But most significantly, I think, obviously cat videos. The world would be a very dark place without these things. But what I find amazing is that in even my lifetime, we've moved through the first cycles from first coming online to the emergence of social media to the prevalence of now what we have, which is tech everywhere. And as such, the plethora of societal and economic benefits which that brings. But what is the future of the internet? And what do we have in store? Well, most of us here recognize, we've heard terms such as this, that everything from future network architectures encompassing 5G to the Internet of Things is set to transform our world further. And why is that? Well, through stuff like IoT, we'll have a proliferation of sensors and data processing at the edge, which could enable real societal progress and improvements to our lives through digital augmentation of our physical world. Beyond that, further on the horizon, we've got emerging nascent technologies, as you again would have known. Everyone talks about artificial intelligence as a big one, and quantum computing significantly. And you may have seen in the last week that there are claims by one particular tech company to have achieved quantum supremacy. What those technologies will do, and the associated follow-on effects of those innovations, will expand the need for data, but also expand the rate at which we produce, analyze, and consume that data as such. But beyond the specific technologies, I think the future is set to incorporate a world where the lines between humans and machines start to blur, where our connectivity will be constant, omnipresent, and actually it will become pretty much invisible. It will be taken for granted much the same way as electricity is today. That's already starting to happen. If you think back to 10 years ago, where we would traditionally connect to the internet through a laptop or a PC, whereas today you can speak to the internet and you can access information through human gestures, and in such a short space of time, that's amazing. Only those lines are going to blur even further to the point where human-machine interaction blends into the background. So that sounds great, but personally, when I think about my children's future, it's hard to be 100% optimistic. I, as a parent, have concerns. We in this room probably all have concerns. My concerns are, for instance, my daughter, who's growing up very much so as a digitally native citizen, Amazon Alexa already knows her favorite song. She can already instruct Alexa to play specific songs on Spotify, and she's 2, right? I mean, that probably tells you a lot about my parenting, but it is a worry. And likewise, as by extension, what are the implications of human-machine interaction in the future? Will the prevalence of human-machine interaction, especially if it's blending into the background, will that dominate a human-to-human interaction? And will we suffer as human beings as a result? On the challenges, I think they're centered around 3 main things. One is cybersecurity, and 2 is inclusion and accessibility, and the 3rd one is around trust. With regards to cybersecurity, we've already seen that the internet has enabled a whole new vector for nefarious activities, for crime, for fraud, for things even up to cyber kidnap, which has now become a thing to take place. What should be noted, however, is that some of these things aren't actually new, that malware has actually been around since the dawn of the computer age, and the development of malware has happened very much in parallel to the evolution of the internet. So behind me is something called the creeper worm. Does anyone know what this is, or has anyone heard of this? Great. So creeper worm, this was developed in 1971. This was applied to the ARPANET. So this was the first piece of self-replicating malware to be applied to the very network that we're talking about, that achievement facilitating that achievement in 1969. So it shows just how short that time horizon was between positive change and then negative development as well. And that's a perennial issue in innovation of any kind. The problem with creating new things is there's always going to be people who use them for good, and there's always going to be people who use them for bad. As we move forward to the year 2000, probably more people will remember this, the I love you bug. So May 2000, this was the first computer worm which caused global impact, and it affected tens of millions of computers. It actually displayed the first kinds of social engineering, which is obviously quite a prevalent risk today. And it was the first computer worm to cause such massive impact on such huge scale that it's had enduring notoriety associated with it as a result. And then, of course, if you fast forward beyond May 2000 to May 2017, we, of course, had WannaCry, which, again, this was a watershed moment for cybersecurity, I feel. Certainly in the UK it was, but globally. It was a WannaCry ransomware attack. It crippled governments, it crippled businesses, and it affected some of the most critical public services, including, of course, the NHS, which was very much covered in the media. So internet connectivity has not only just enabled criminal activity on a more localized scale, but it's also enabled a new domain of interstate conflict to emerge. With things such as influence campaigns, alleged election interference, and state-sponsored cyber activity, which, for instance, the NotPetya attack, which happened shortly after WannaCry in 2017, was attributed to. These are recent examples of how this medium is starting to disrupt the international rules-based order. So when I hear Alan talk about the geopolitical dimension within which the original evolution of the internet emerged from, it is very synonymous in many ways with some of the challenges that we face today. As we move into a world where everything is connected, where that human-machine interaction is starting to become invisible, where connectivity is total and ubiquitous, well, in my view, and in kind of very much the industry's view, we believe security needs to move in the same way. It needs to blend into the background. It needs to be invisible, but it also needs to be omnipresent. It needs to be integrated at every layer within the technology ecosystem. What that means is it needs to be everywhere from the chip to the cloud. So, as an example of how much we care about this, at Lorca, we're very much strategically focusing a lot of our effort on advancing the secure by design agenda. Because what we want to do is move away from the predominant approach to security which has existed traditionally, which is approaching security as an afterthought or bolting it on at the end. It needs to be inherent in everything. So, as Eva mentioned before me, the original principle behind the architecture of the internet was decentralization, open source, and self-governance. However, through the emergence of follow-on innovations, this is not how it's panned out. She said that, you all know that, and there are plenty of cases that are testament to that. For example, the internet started to grow, to seek massive adoption through the 90s, and then through the 2000s, you had the emergence of social media platforms, for instance, and as a result, mass collection of personal data through those platforms. Not necessarily a bad thing. However, what that has started to do, coupled with other innovations such as cloud computing, as Eva mentioned, is that starts to cause a centralization of data and a concentration of risk, and therefore a major challenge and a major shift away from the original principles of the internet's architecture in the early days. So certainly centralization in terms of data is certainly suboptimal. And not only does it create, singular points of failure, but it also leaves these single points of failure and concentrations of data open to abuse. And the most eminent example of that in recent years was obviously Cambridge Analytica, as you all know. And I believe that the future of the internet should very much move back to the principle of decentralization, that we should have a model in place and should we move to a model which protects the privacy of users, but it also maintains the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of that information. Those things are key to enabling the internet to go to the next level and to rebuild trust. But it's not also about security, which will enable mass adoption. You obviously have to give people access to this stuff, right? It's because we've already talked about the amazing things the internet's done in the last 50 years, and I've referenced the amazing things that it could do in the next 50 years. But without access to those benefits, you can't participate. So as of April 2019, we have just over half the world's population online, which is great, but obviously demonstrates that there's still a long way to go to enable equality of opportunity. Not only is access to the internet dominated by those countries with the largest GDPs, so you can see the dark blue on this map, which exemplifies that, but there are wider socioeconomic, demographic barriers and cultural barriers in place, which actually mirror many of the challenges that we have in society today. So the future direction of the internet needs to be developed with all humans in mind. We need to put in place the infrastructure and bias that towards those who need it the most, and we need to make it usable and understandable for everybody. Physical access is not the sole enabler, though. Like any innovation through the ages, users need to trust the technology before they fully adopt it. And what of trust? Well, techlash, which it may be a term that you've heard of, it is happening. It's real. People fear big tech. We talk about the major social media platforms, we talk about the big cloud providers, centralization of data, et cetera, it is a real concern for people. And there's a growing wave, as we all know, and maybe we're part of that, of anti-tech sentiment due to things such as a lack of transparency and a perception of monopolistic approaches and practices. The development of the future internet needs to be based upon a core set of principles, I believe, which are human rights, privacy and security, and also using those as forces for good to build trust. The UN, in fact, defines access to the internet as a fundamental human right, and therefore we need to take a human-centric approach to development. So just before I close, the last thing I wanted to cover was actually a quote from Leonard Kleinrock. So in 2009, he was being interviewed by CNN, and he was asked to reflect on his team's achievement back in 1969. And what of the internet that he created and how has it become? So he said, the culture of the original internet was one of trust. I believe by acting on those three things, we can enable that human-centric approach to emerge and use the internet, and continue to use the internet as a force for good over the next 50 years and beyond. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great evening.
How do I get back to my slideshow? There we go, recognise that guy? I've got some bad news, guys. It's getting to that time of the evening we're going to have to close. I know there's a couple of taxis booked. Alan very kindly moved a flight so he could be here today, and he's got a very early flight tomorrow morning as a result, so I'm afraid Alan's got to leave us. I think Peter has to leave us too. So we did intend to have some questions at the end, but I'm afraid we might have missed that chance. I just wanted to conclude with a quote. This campus here at Here East is a collection of startups, artists, government organisations, universities, all working together. It's a digital innovation campus, and it's trying to achieve the same sort of things that Xerox PARC and ARPA were trying to achieve. And when I said to Alan, what is it about Xerox PARC and the ARPA community that made it work? And he said, have you ever read Wind in the Willows? And I think I did when I was a child. And he said, yeah, and you said to me, there's nothing half as much worth doing as messing around in boats. And yeah, here's to messing about in boats. And thank you very much to all the speakers. Absolutely incredible. It's been a real privilege. All four of you absolutely brilliant. Thanks to Here East and Plexel for letting me host the event. Thanks to ESOP for doing all the graphics. And thank you all for coming. So here's to everyone. Just one thing before I go. Friend and colleague Nico MacDonald has got a website called spy.co.uk. He was early when he's got a 3-letter domain. He's putting out a call for people to talk about and discuss what the next 50 years of the internet holds. And if you want to say something quickly, Nico.
Yeah, very briefly. It's been very inspiring this evening hearing from all our speakers, Alan and Peter particularly. And I think that kind of level of vision and insight and desire to really understand how technology and society work together and how we develop and use technologies for making the world a better place is really important. And I'd love to see a more public discussion about how we leverage future, what might be called general purpose technologies like the internet, how we shape the internet over the next 50 years in our own image and to better our society. That's being done by lots of people in different places around the world, but I really feel that we should have a more public discourse with everyday people, with people who are here, with people in universities, with people in companies, with people in government, and share some of the insights and learnings that we've discovered over the last 50 years and beyond, as you can see from Alan's timeline, which goes back to Lord Byron and Ada Lovelace and so on. So anybody who's interested in how we share our insights, how we really learn, how we really investigate what we've achieved and use that to think about what we can achieve, please come and talk to me. I'll be hanging around for a drink and I'd love to talk to you more. Jim's put my website on the page as well and you can respond in that way as well. I'm not sure quite how we're going to do this. I think maybe we have to reinvent what socio-technical research is. Maybe we don't. But I'd love for people interested in that to join me. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Now there's going to be some drinks, and for those of you that are interested, we're going to play a half-an-hour interview that we did with Leonard Kleinrock earlier in the year, but that's perfectly optional. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.